Welcome, everyone. My name is Hillevi Garnets, and I'm the professor at Gender Studies, the Department of Gender Studies here at Stockholm University. And we are all here in order to listen to Beverley Skeggs, who this year is appointed as honorary doctor at the Faculty of Humanities. Gender Studies nominated her, and we are incredibly pleased with the result. She's sitting here now. And yes. And Beverley held the Kerstin Hesselgren Chair in 2007 at our department. And we have also a lot of other exciting activities at Gender Studies. My colleague Lena Gemse will mention some of those.
Yeah, we would like to take this opportunity to tell you about a new network for collaboration that we have created. In 2009, we took the initiative to create what we call the Gender Academy of Stockholm University. And this is new in the sense that it's a network not of individuals but of departments who wish to collaborate in the area of gender research. And these are departments that already have strong gender research. So the aim here is twofold, both to, of course, to collaborate, to make events like these come out to the whole university, so people can come and listen, and to, of course, stimulate research and discussion within the Gender Academy, and also to establish and make known at Stockholm University to give a recognition to the strength and vitality of gender research as a whole, as it is carried out not only at Gender Studies but in a number of disciplines. And in this context, we are very proud of the fact that not only one, Professor Skeggs, but two of this year's honorary doctors actually are prominent gender researchers nominated by disciplines, members of the Gender Academy. So we can listen to Professor Skeggs today, and next week there will be a speech by Professor Miriam Glucksman, who is then appointed honorary doctor at the Faculty of Social Sciences. And she will give a speech entitled 30-Year Reflections on Women on the Line, Changes and Continuities in Women's Work. She was nominated by the Department of Economic History, which is one of the disciplines at Stockholm University that has a strong gender profile. So this is one thing, and you can pick up flyers here on your way out to see the details. And we also would like to mention yet another event in the area of international exchange in these days, that internationalization, as it is called in Swedish, has been like a word that we think that this is what will make our research better and stimulate more research. So we have another event in a similar vein. This will be open lectures in the area of gender and religion. We have invited a number of scholars who will discuss the many challenges facing the study of gender and religion. And there will be two open lectures on October 13th, that is Thursday, the week after. And these are lectures by Professor Linda Woodhead at Lancaster University. She will speak on the topic Past Achievements and New Directions in the Gendering of Religion. And then we will also welcome Professor Jill Dubish from Northern Arizona University, who will enlighten us on the very big question, can there be religion without gender? And that's it. And you can pick up flyers also on these lectures, and you are welcome to all of these events.
So, Beverley Skeggs is head of department and professor of sociology at the Goldsmiths College, University of London. And she also held positions in women's studies and cultural studies. She has conducted several research projects, the latest about class and reality television. Is that right? Mm. In connection with this project, she is currently working on 2 books. I found Beverley Skeggs' research interests listed on her homepage. They are, listen now, class, media and cultural formations, feminist and post-structuralist theory, Pierre Bourdieu and Marx, violence. And it's a wonderful and important mixture, I think. And these interests, with the class in its center, is also reflected in her former books. Class, Self and Culture came 2004 and is a study of the middle class. Formations of before that, she published Formations of Class and Gender, Becoming Respectable, på svenska, Att bli respektabel. Och den kom 1997 på svenska, tror jag. Ja. Konstruktioner av kön, klass och kön. And that book came 1997 and made her famous, not at least here in Sweden with this translation. And it is this book she will revisit today. Beverley Skeggs will speak in about 1 hour, and then it's plenty of time for questions. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Is that working? Is that okay? Right. Well, I'd like to say thank you very much for having me back, and thank you especially, Hilvi, for all the work you put into this and terrifying me about wearing the right clothes this afternoon for the that we all have to do. But I'm absolutely delighted to be back here in Stockholm. I spent 6 months here, actually in 2007, and it was one of the best intellectual kind of periods of my life. I was challenged, so I'm waiting for the challenges to come later. I was challenged on practically everything I said, almost, as I walked down the corridor. So it was a really, really rigorous kind of experience, and one that I really, really loved. And so I was getting very nostalgic when I walked back and kind of came into the department and like, yeah, well, this is great. So thank you for inviting me back. It's always been a really wonderful experience. I woke up in the middle of the night and thought, oh my God, I haven't defined respectability, which is one of the things that you do when you've written a paper and you suddenly go, the fundamental concept hasn't been defined. So I'll do it now to make sure there's no worries over what it is. Respectability, I argue, is a practice that's based usually, it's a gendered practice usually, but not always, because there's lots of very interesting work on black men in Chicago by Michel Lamont. But usually a gender practice, and it's based around femininity, it's based around clothes, aesthetics, looking right, cleaning is absolutely essential, hygiene, discourses of hygiene, caring, and it's about always trying to get something right, to become the proper person. And I want to argue it's probably the most ideological form of self-persecution that there ever is, absolutely fundamental to governance. And kind of pre-capitalist governance in that sense. But it's based upon often imagining an imaginary dialogical other that is judging you as being lacking, as not being right. And so it's a sense that you're living in a state of anxiety, an affective state of constant not knowing how to do it properly, and always feeling that you are being judged. So judge is crucial. And this is why... Ooh, still got that noise. This is the other cover to the book, which was meant to be gold and turned out to be yellow, which is meant to be the worst design colour ever. But I want to say, if I put these on, I then lose my thing. I knew that would happen. Hold on. Stick that back on. There's a quote. Sorry. Is it the wrong way around? Okay. Not designed for people who wear glasses. I'll take them off after this. Thank you. You can. Sorry. Is it all right? Is that all right? Yeah, okay. I should have done that. I knew I should have done this. But I think the key to this whole lecture, in fact, the key to the whole book, probably the key to my life really, is a comment made by Yvonne in 1992. And she's just moved into her new house that she's got married, she's had a child, and she's got a mortgage. And she says, all my life I've wanted to say, look, I'm as good as you. Well, now I think this house says it. It says, I've made it, I'm respectable, and you can't put me down. And that, to me, is the absolute key to respectability. It's living in a constant state of feeling that you are being judged. It doesn't matter whether you are or you aren't. You feel that you are being judged according to somebody else's standards. The history of respectability that I'm speaking to, and the one that became very pertinent for what was an 11-year ethnographic research project that turned into this book, is based upon a very particular British variant of respectability, which came about through the beginnings of social work, Octavia Hill in Britain, where middle-class women attempting to escape the domestic ideology of Victorian times, where they were trapped in the home, actually started going out and finding work for themselves, but finding it through evangelical religion, where they went into working-class areas to tell the working-class women how to behave. And the standards that they used to tell them how to behave were really inappropriate things, like you should wear white as a sign of goodness. Now, this was in the period when in East London, open sewage was about a foot high, so wearing long white dresses kind of epitomises how totally inappropriate and how the standards and interests of one group, middle-class women trying to escape domestic constraint, were imposed upon another group with entirely different moral and economic standards, entirely different forms of life. But that, to me, is the kind of the crux of the gendered class struggle that is made through the performance of respectability. So that's the kind of definition, and that's what I'm talking about. So, we've lost the bits that run in. PowerPoint didn't work again. So if I take it off, I'll work to the screen. So, I did realise probably halfway through writing this, and probably had a sense, has that gone off now? Is that on? That's on, okay. That really, this book is all about my mother. And I could actually hear it in my head this morning as I was walking out going, all your colours don't match, your hair's a mess. And what happens if you get run over wearing those underpants? You know, it's kind of, I can hear it all the time. So it is all about my mother. I like the Almodovar film. And every time I visit her, she's now very frail. She's 85. She's very ill. But still, it's like, why is your hair a mess? Why haven't you done this? Why haven't you done that? Why haven't you made your bed? Have you washed your neck? She still checks my neck. Right? So this is all about my mother, who is completely persecuted by respectability all her life, even now, persecuted by respectability. And that persecution is a form of subjectivity. She does it to herself. She does it to me. She does it to my dad. So it's a very particular form of self-governance and self-persecution. Anyway, the book began. I didn't know it was about my mother when the book began in 1981 as a PhD. The book began actually as a PhD, and it was very much, and this is going to be significant because I say return to ideology, it was about how state cuts to welfare, Thatcherism, was absolutely beginning to hit. So I began my PhD. I lost my first grant to do my PhD, so it really hit me. How Thatcherism literally set up lots of training courses which were based on the Victorian model, so again, very significant in terms of respectable ideologies, based on the model of schools for mothers, whereby working-class women were sent into particular schools and colleges to learn how to become caring mothers, cleaning, hygienic subjects. Interestingly, and I'll try not to go off on too many tangents, one of the very interesting histories of the schools for mothers was that there were not enough men to be killed in the Boer War. There was not enough infantry for the British Army in the Boer War. So there's lots of government reports on why schools for mothers should be established to generate more hygienic standards so that more boy children would live, infant mortality would increase, and they could therefore be sent off to war as part of the colonial project. So the colonial project is in here somewhere in the history of respectability. This leads into the reproduction of this model of schooling in the 1980s called caring courses. Interesting, we're now back in Tory Britain. You've all seen the riots. We know we're there. We expected it would happen. It certainly has happened, and it will continue to happen. Back into Tory Britain, we now have The same emphasis being put on mothers. They still don't bring their children up correctly. Working class mothers are inadequate, and they are the ones who are now going to lose their benefits and be fined if their children are out on the street. So this is a long and historical model that's mapped in the book, and it's absolutely a perfect model for what's happening at the moment. The interesting thing at the moment is that there isn't a massive emphasis on putting money into education itself. In fact, if anybody knows, all the money's coming out of education. It's coming out of everything, and everything's been privatised. So it's not the same as the initial formations work, where the state is containing children, boys and girls, in schools to stop them rioting on the street. Now they don't mind if they riot on the street because they can sort them out through criminalisation later on. So it's a very different politics in that sense, but the model of working class mothers being held to blame for the problems of the nation through their lack of respectable mothering is exactly the same. So the historical legacies are absolutely key to the book Formations of Class and Gender and to the research project. I also want to say, and I'm just throwing this in case there's questions about this later, it was a very particular method at the time of doing research. It was ethnography, but it was ethnography with a very particular kind of historical materialist understanding, moving from what people say to abstract understandings. And I had a huge problem at the time because I wanted to use the word class to understand the relationships that were being lived between the middle class teachers and authorities and the working class women that I was studying. And they didn't want to use the term at all. They hated the term class. I'll go on to talk about this, but that's how I talk about moving from the concrete, what people say, to the abstract, how we understand what they say. So there's a kind of methodological underpinning right the way through this, which hopefully will make sense of why I will use concepts and they won't. I use concepts because I have access to them in that way. So it's a very traditional beginning in that sense. I wanted to understand how people lived their conditions, how they made history, but not in the conditions of their own choosing, the classic Marxist point, which is now being taken up much more recently with critiques by Zizek about, yes, everybody knows the conditions they're living in, they just can't do anything about it. So kind of lots of good critiques of ideology happening. It began, I was part of a kind of tradition of British cultural studies, sociology, Althuserian, Louis Althusser, the French philosopher who killed his wife, very into Catholicism. That's how I remembered him. Really brilliant analysis, absolutely brilliant. Lots of people are now rereading Althusser to say, yeah, we kind of threw him out. Well, he threw himself out the window, didn't he? We kind of got rid of him. But very, very important. But he totally believes in interpolation. You will do as ideology expects you to do on the basis of misrecognition. Huge kind of debates in there that I can enter into but won't. So it was a critique of that because it's not me. Because he assumed that everybody did what they were expected to do ideologically. And at the time, I wanted to say they don't. Working class women do not do what they are expected to do ideologically. I'm now rethinking that position. But more importantly, I'd argue, it's informed by Gramsci and the idea of why do people give consent to that which subordinates them? The absolute, to me, key ideological question. Why do we give consent to that which appears not to be in our interests? Or is it a value? That's the question I'm going to move on to. And interestingly, I used Bourdieu very early on, partly because he gives you so much explanatory value for thinking beyond economics, thinking beyond pure economics. And you've got to remember I began this study, and I'm apologising, in the 1980s. And he was kind of really ripping apart quite a lot of traditional Marxism and kind of the more radical feminism. He could be used to kind of understand quite a lot of that. I also use Foucault, and the reason, and you know, I'm always saying to my PhD students, be very careful how you put theories together. They are epistemologically, you know, do not fit. But Foucault is really useful for understanding figures. What figures are produced? What discourses are produced through figures? The big problem with Foucault is that he forgot ideology, and he does go back into it right at the very end in his new lectures that have just been translated. So there is there's a whole history that goes on there. And the point of telling you this history is that I do think we are the products of our own historical emergence, of the theories that we come through, of the questions that we have to answer, of the kind of challenges that we have to face. So as a PhD student in the 1980s, I had to be able to answer what was wrong with Althusser. I had to understand Foucault. There's no way I could get away with it. So we have to. We are located by the knowledge that we enter into, and then we have to understand what we do with it. At that time, I was very much part of British Cultural Studies, which was influenced by Stuart Hall, much more concrete. Stuart Hall's book, Policing the Crisis, absolutely brilliant. Reread it again if you want to understand the riots in Britain. History repeats itself, tragedy and farce again and again and again. Superb work that actually worked with people, that started bringing race and gender really onto the agenda. David Morley, media theorist I work with now, really important work in terms of how people understood the media, very, very important. And Angela McRobbie on ideologies of femininity, reading Jackie magazine, absolutely crucial work. So I want to kind of name check these people because they were all so important in that kind of the formation of me before it became the formation of the book. Christine Griffin is often kind of not noticed in that history, but really, really important. Did feminist ethnography at the centre, you probably know, Johan, really, really, really important, and did a book called Typical Girls, very important work on working class girls. And then, of course, Paul Willis, that most people know and totally influenced me in terms of understanding Marxism and working class boys in Wolverhampton. That's what I mean, concrete abstract, what a gap, and he made it. So really, overall, the book, the study, my life, my mother, it's a study of injustice. How we live injustice and how our subjectivity is shaped by understanding injustice through judgment. We live it as a feeling of being judged, where in fact it's about total inequality and injustice. And so it was a very interesting moment when Hillary said to me, will you revisit formations? And you thought I'd say, and I'd just been writing the conclusion to the reality TV book on the media. And I'd gone right back to it because I could hear, I was haunted by the voices in this book as I was writing the end to the reality TV project, which is all about moral economies. So they were there. It was ever present. There's Tory Britain going on around me, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, all the mothers are being fined for what their children did. And I'm thinking, yeah, I will revisit it. This is really, really, really important. So it was a great opportunity to kind of go back and think, which are the bits that matter, which are the bits that stay with me, which are the bits that don't. So thank you. It was good. I was being haunted, and then I had to, something's going on. Now look, 1:30 last night, we were trying to make this work. Whoops, is that a bit small? Can you see that? Yeah. Okay. So it is a longitudinal ethnographic study. It's based on 83 working class women, and it looks at how they were symbolically positioned without value. Value, that's the revisiting bit. At the time, the book wasn't about value, but I realised in retrospect that's what the book is all about. How they were continually positioned as lacking, inadequate, faulty subjects, deficit culture, deficit practices, deficit morality. Everything about them was read as a problem. They needed rectifying. Their education was about rectifying them. The health workers who came in to visit them was about rectifying them. And there's a lovely quote in the book where they talk about, and even my Hoover was in the wrong place. And the health visitor who I talked to says, hopeless, you can't even put a Hoover away when I come and visit. And I'm thinking, yeah, Hoover, how significant is that to understand how people bring up their children? So, this is about every single practice they did was nearly always judged by state representatives, the state institutions, as lacking, as problematic, and they were judged. They were totally judged. Their teachers wondered why they were teaching them. They're only going to get pregnant anyway. So it was like a whole history of judgment all the way through. Their bodies were read as pathological, they were read as excessive, they were noisy, they were dirty, they didn't clean enough, they were too loud. They went out, they created chaos, they smoked too much, they drank too much, they ate too much, everything about them was excessive. In every form of state judgment, they were seen to be pathological. At the time, I didn't see this as all being about value. They were actually attributed with no value. They were seen to be valueless, and they were not just seen to be valueless, they were seen to be problematic. Now, the whole book, the whole study is how they challenge this. They fight back. They go, no, we're not rubbish. And the whole book is just loads of quotes really about, no, we're not rubbish. We are respectable. So they use respectability to establish their value, to prove that they have some value. So my mother, makes the bed before she goes out, makes sure she's got totally clean underwear on, makes sure her hair's perfect in case anybody says, you haven't been looking after yourself. And not investing in oneself is a key sign of not having any value. They literally do it continually. And just all the quotes are about this clothing says I'm respectable, this housing says I'm respectable, this furniture says I'm respectable. Marriage, so significant. I am respectable. So they're all trying to claim respectability. But one thing I really want to stress that has been picked up is people say this means they want to be middle class. They do not want to be middle class. They recognise the middle class and they think the middle class are the ones who shouldn't have authority, have bad taste, don't know what to do with all their money and can't dress properly. So they definitely do not get the impression that they want to be middle class. They do not want to be middle class. They have a sense that they are being judged by the middle class. They can recognise some of them, the ones who literally in the encounter judge them, and they have an imaginary of the middle class. And that's codified through the term posh, which is a very difficult term in kind of trying to pin down. They're posh. It's often loaded with affective derision. So they try to invest in respectability. Now, that was a kind of powerful statement of how respectability was a challenge. But what ultimately happens through this investment in respectability is they become trapped in it. Partly through caring. They're on caring courses. They end up on caring courses because they can't do anything else. A lot of them would like to do hairdressing, but they can't afford the equipment. Some of them would like to do cooking, but they can't afford the food. And a lot of the parents don't want them to go into education because it costs a lot of money. But at that time, unlike now, they could have bus passes and they got a very small student grant. There's nothing anymore for students at 16, so they wouldn't even be going on these courses if they existed in the same numbers. But they go and they learn to be caring. And all the way through, and again, one of the chapters in the book is about how they know how to care. Tell me if you know a working class woman who hasn't been taught to care by her mothers who's completely obsessed with, making beds properly and hoovering and, all the stuff that kind of looking after children, babysitting, they know how to care, but then they get told that the way they know how to care is wrong. So they keep trying to prove that what they do is right. So they're kind of stuck in this battle over whose standards count, whose standards matter, but very importantly, who has the authority to define the standards. And because authority is linked to institutions, the teachers have the authority, the health workers have the authority, the social workers have the authority, the welfare officers have the authority, some forms of authority actually count. What they consider to be their authority is a very different, non-institutionalised form, and I want to argue later on that that's a different form of relationality. So I want to argue that they live this daily. It's a daily struggle that they're involved in. So they're not just persecuting themselves through the standards of others, they're constantly trying to prove to other people who judge them that they are good, or better even, that they can do things differently. So it's a struggle. This is not just like living life without any hassle. This is a daily battle and a daily struggle, so that when they get up in the morning, they think, am I wearing the right clothes? Is it a bad hair day? That kind of thing. Is it, constantly judgments. Now, lots of people live those judgments, but it's when they become institutionalised and tied to forms of power and connected right across lots of spheres and lots of social spaces that it matters. So everybody might be having a bad hair day, but not for everybody will it be seen as a form of subjectivity in which you are lacking. So it's not just the judgment, it's how that gets institutionalised that's key. So then I go on to look at how they disidentified with the term working class. And it's like, how can you write a book about working class women when they don't want to be called working class? And in the 1980s, this was quite a problem, quite a huge issue for, was I just imposing my authority in that kind of very unfeminist way? And in the end, I decided, or at least I worked out the reason they didn't want to be called working class, because unlike working class men who have a history of romanticised heroic labour that they can associate with, and Paul Willis's work is about how working class boys think they're great because, you know, they're hard and they're heavy and they're strong and they're macho. For women, working class women, they don't have that. Their potential for establishing positive value is really, really limited, because they are positioned as the excessive group in Britain. They're going to have too many children, they're not going to be able to look after them properly, and they're going to end up with having them criminalised. And that's just kind of the vulgar, obviously, extreme position rhetorically that I'm making. But that's why they disidentified from the term working class. Really, really important. Likewise, I found that theories of femininity at the time didn't really fit them. And then I realised, of course, that's historical as well. Working class women were never expected to fit the model of femininity that a lot of feminist theory in the 1980s and 90s was using, and saying, you know, women are stupid because they're feminine. And it's like, well, actually, working class women have never been feminine. They do actually either a very extreme form of femininity, which is always read as excessive, pathological, etc. You know, I'm going to say, I don't need to carry on repeating things. But also that they literally cannot be the passive, quiet, gentle soul of traditional Victorian femininity, because they're always out at work. And we know from lots of the kind of social research, the Mayhews and the ethnographies of London, that, you know, part of the fascination with working class women was that they were so hard and dirty. Do you remember Arthur Mumby's stuff? You know, his total fascination with the big dirty hands of Hannah Cullick, who he eventually marries. But there's a kind of fetishization of the non-femininity of working class women. So the feminist theory that takes up ideas about femininity becomes quite problematic. So I'm having a big problem at this moment when I'm writing the book. They don't fit the class. They do, but not. They don't want to use the word class, and they don't work in terms of traditional understandings of gender. That's why I said it was the hardest thing I ever wrote, because I'm struggling to think, how on earth does all this work when none of the theories that I have actually make sense of it at the time? And so at that moment, we were beginning to get Judith Butler's ideas around performativity, gender as an iterative performance that's unconsciously performed. But what I saw in the book was loads of kind of really full-on big performances of femininity, excessive femininity. That which is now totally encapsulated by reality TV and the women behaving very badly. And I know some of you have seen Ladette to Lady, where we get the absolute extreme forms of femininity being performed, and we get the aristocratic women trying to control them and making them become quiet and beige and non-excessive. So I had all these struggles, but I did realise that absolutely central to this is a debate over morality. Ultimately, whose morals count, and in a bigger sense, what are the ethics of class politics? Ooh. I have no idea why it's doing this. It didn't do this on my laptop. Oh, maybe. This is like a shadow underneath. Okay. I'm just going to go through this one very, very quickly, just in case people are interested. It did begin with Bourdieu. And again, thinking about the theory I was using, Bourdieu was incredibly important for expanding understandings of the economic. Very, very important for understanding how people can or cannot accumulate capitals in their various different forms in volume and composition. And I think for me the most important thing about Bourdieu's analysis is how we can access those capitals and how they lead to bodily dispositions. Bodily dispositions of entitlement and confidence and value. Whereas for the women I was studying, their bodies were based on taking themselves out of spaces. No confidence, anxiety, not getting it right, being judged. These are radically different bodily dispositions, very effective, very bodily, that do not enable you to feel that you have and can move through social space. So very different. Now for Bourdieu, and I do have, I've edited a book with Lisa Adkins, Feminism After Bourdieu. Yeah, that's right. Where we do kind of go into these debates in a lot of detail, so I'm not going to go through them now. But I want to argue that Bourdieu is a great starting place, but we can't end with him, because he doesn't help us to understand how those who are powerless live powerlessness, but he's brilliant for understanding how those who have power live power. So for me, his work is superb for understanding how power works, understanding how those can move through space with ease, through entitlement, but he cannot help us to understand those that cannot. And if we use Bourdieu's models of capital, and for him, cultural capital is always about high cultural capital, that which can be exchanged, that which can be converted, I argue that things like femininity and working class practices, working classness, that which is beyond middle class practices, are actually beyond Bourdieu's analysis. And I'm like pushing that angle at the moment in lots of different ways through various different research studies. But it kind of my first challenge to Bourdieu came through this, because I kept thinking femininity just doesn't work if I want to mobilise Bourdieu's analysis. Femininity doesn't fit. It isn't a form of powerless. But how do I understand something which is so symbolically significant? Femininity is everywhere. There's a lovely comment by Peggy Phelan, the performance theorist, that if we understood the most present symbolic form as a measure of power, it would be naked young white women who would have all the power in Western societies, because they're the ones we see the most on billboards, on television, selling things. But it's not visualization, representation doesn't necessarily connect to power. And it's kind of that made me think that Bourdieu is a theorist of social reproduction and power, but much less able to understand powerlessness and ambiguity. So, and then gender, I kind of say this is why gender theories didn't work at this moment. And I'm going to go through this, and then I'm going to go say what's missing from respectability. So I'm kind of moving into the revisiting. And it began with this, but it's kind of moving on. And so I realised when trying to understand gender through the women in the book that gender and sexuality is not an object or property of identity. It's a practice. It's something we do, but it's something we may not ever be able to do. It's an achievement that we may not be able to make. And the women in the book could never do femininity properly. Properly is a key word, absolute key word. And so the women of formations displayed their distance from femininity through explicit performances. This was not performativity, because they couldn't do it, because it wasn't a historical possibility, and because, and this is very, very important, I think, because they function in that very traditional anthropological way Mary Davis defines as the constitutive limit. The proper and the normative need the improper and the non-normative to define themselves. It's constitutive. They require that. And at the moment, we see it an incredible amount through the definition of the new feral underclass. So gender, I argue, is a resource to which one does or does not have access that can or cannot be deployed and can be put into practice in various different ways to realise value. So certain forms of caring could realise a value, other forms of caring could not. For the working class women, most things that they did could not realise a value beyond their local fields of exchange. So this led me into, and this is where I kind of start moving off and start developing. I didn't put my glasses back on again, so hopefully I'm getting to that bit, where I start arguing and start kind of taking on ideas around subjectivity and identity. Now, you've got to remember, this book came out in 1997. Big moment for identity politics, theories of identity. And at this moment, I've moved into post-structuralism. Lots of people accuse me of being a post-structuralist, don't they, all the time. So it's a very interesting moment in terms of where I start writing, who I'm writing for and who I'm writing to. I wrote this while I was at Lancaster University, surrounded by some of the most amazing feminist theorists in the world who have now moved on. People like Jackie Stacey, Sarah Franklin, Sarah Ahmed, Celia Lurie, Lynn Pierce and Alison Young, and we were all working on our first books, really, and kind of arguing and whatever. And I think that's why ideology disappeared. I was arguing with them most of the time. So this is how I got into these debates. And again, significant in terms of how knowledge is produced. And when you go back, you think, why didn't I write about that? And it's like, well, I was probably having an argument with Sarah at the time about something. So this is what happened. So really, at that particular moment, there were really big debates going on about misrecognition, what is identity, how to make identity claims. Class had literally been lost off the kind of academic map because it was associated with a very traditional form of Marxism. And I would argue that it kind of, the working class proved not to be the revolutionary force that lots of middle class people hoped they would be. They didn't run off to the barricades and attack capitalism. They bought televisions instead, and they continually tend to be a failure for the bourgeoisie that invest in them to do the violence of the revolutionary struggle. So, you know, I think they weren't doing what they were expected to do, and therefore, as well as Marxism kind of going off the agenda, I think the working class kind of failed to be the good revolutionary subject. And Valerie Walker-Dean has done some really good work on this. So, lots of arguments were going on around the politics of recognition. Alex Honneth, Nancy Fraser, Charles Taylor, that if you wanted to be the recognisable proper subject of, and they don't say capitalism, but that's what they mean, you have to have recognition. Now, I realised, and I'm hoping you're getting to this point too, is that if you are continually made visible and misrecognised as having no value, the last thing you want to do is engage in struggles for misrecognition, which are always going to be futile. So the idea of saying, hey, look at me, recognise me as having value is never going to work, because we are looking at you and you are wrong. So struggles for recognition would never work, never going to work. Remember the word constitutive. These women are the constitutive limit. They don't just go, oh, I can be part of that. They function to prove what they cannot be part of. So recognition politics is never going to work in terms of working class women, ever. Identity is not going to work. They don't want to identify with the term working class. In the book, they actually don't want to identify with the term feminism either, but then they come on to recognising lots of feminist politics in a very, very different way. So, again, along with people like Sarah Ahmed and Mariam Fraser's, I think, brilliant article in TCS that kind of challenges what I did but uses it in a way that I could never have done. She basically says that for those who are forced into visibility, claiming visibility as a form of politics is never going to work. So if you're black and used to be the bad black subject, going, oh, I'm the good black subject, is never going to work as a form of politics. Likewise, working class, it's not going to work. There's a similar politics going on. And how can you claim recognition if you feel everything you do is continually misrecognised? There's also a methodological issue involved in this, which became apparent through reality TV, is that the women are constantly called to account for themselves. Why are you doing that? Why did you do that? Why did you have this many children? Why are you eating that food? Reality television is all about making the working class feel that everything they do is wrong. So that's an extreme statement, but I have nuanced it in a big research project, where they learn that every single practice, they eat the wrong food, they do the wrong things, they don't go to the gym, they don't have the right haircuts, everything about them is wrong. So they are, on reality TV, expected to spectacularly perform their lack of value. In education, they were expected to perform their lack of value. Constantly, in front of welfare, they are told they have no value. So having to continually perform your lack of value means that recognition politics and visibility are even more problematic. This means that they cannot make the same positive, public, subjective displays of worth. And even if they did, it's unlikely they would be recognised as such. So there's a huge, huge problem here as this book enters a very particular form of politics. Class has gone off the agenda. Identity politics comes in, and they kind of get wiped off even more. And so they don't have many positions to take. So the continuing themes of the book, which I'm now going to go into kind of what's missing and what's developed, are gender, femininity and motherhood are an achievement that for the working class is rarely made in the way that they are expected to. The book details the ambivalence of gender roles. It's not pure social reproduction. They don't fit, they can't fit, it's ambivalent, it's difficult. Everything they do, they get wrong. They get trapped into the paradoxes of caring. They can't disassociate being caring from the labour of caring, and they're the people who are expected to perform labour, like the privatisation of care. They're the ones who are doing all of that now. All their value is permanently inscribed on their bodies. Their bodies are read as the source of value. Everything that you can see on them is seen to be problematic. But they have very different values depending on where they can convert. So these women, in their local forms of symbolic exchange, say their local marriage markets, had value, but once they moved beyond that, they didn't have value. I think the book shows that living gender cannot be disassociated from class, but I think it can in terms of understanding it through abstraction. And I think class is produced, and I will argue this constantly. I am not a class theorist who believes in fitting people into the categories 1 to 7 of the Registrar General's, recently modified by Goldthorpe and Lockwood, and recently more modified by Rose scales. I'm not into measurement. I don't care about measurement. Class is a relationship. It's a fundamental relationship between groups in which one group's gain is another group's loss. To me, respectability is the absolute fundamental politics of where we see that relationship played out. One group judges another as lacking, the other group tries to resist and lives up to those standards. This is class lived through struggle, subjectivity and relationship, not measurement. So if somebody says to me, how many middle-class people are there in Britain now? I don't know and I don't care, but I know they're still persecuting the working class. So I think our new projects show how disidentification is still working. It's going on all the time. Our projects, we've done one on men entering universities through widening participation, and a new project on reality television, all about disidentification still. The men identify as working class. They call it flat capping it, you know, the flat caps that workers used to wear. So they say, we're flat capping it, we're working class and we're proud. None of the women do that. We had one who kind of thought, well, might be okay to be working class, and again, she was 80. So, you know, there's the kind of disidentification is still pretty significant. And I think the continuing themes, judgment. It's kind of, you go back to something and you think, why didn't I make more of that? Judgment, value, and then I'm going on to ideology. And I want to argue that this is a struggle. The misrecognition of value produced in the class relationship produces confusion for the women, but also challenges. And one of the very interesting things from the reality TV project was that the working class women can't understand why they're being judged all the time as wrong. And if you think about it, it's perplexing. I don't think my mum understands, because she doesn't know who's judging her. It's like, why are they so wrong? They don't know why they are wrong, and they don't know why they are continually subject to judgment. So politically, I think this is very important, because they're both perplexed by what's happening to them. But in their struggles to have value, they engage in the game of trying to gain consent for being proper. So there's something really key in that kind of perplexity. And what do we do in terms of politics to deal with that? So what's missing from Formations, from the book? And it's interesting, they've just produced a new cover for it, and I really could now write another edition and say, this is what should be in there. Forgot where I was for a while. It's the massive, strong sense of injustice that they live daily. They live the feeling of injustice. And that's what I think is really, really different as a class politics. And this injustice manifests itself in various different ways. Very, very powerful affects. And it's very interesting when you go back. I went back to listen to some of the, got boxes and boxes of tapes and things. And there's a lot of comedy, which I could do a whole lecture on the comedy of the research. There's a lot of comedy, there's a lot of laughing, there's a lot of making it feel okay. But there's also real anger, real irritation. And what I've argued with another project is there's this like low-level humming resentment. They resent the fact that they're being judged, but they don't know exactly why. And it produces a resentment. And so when some of the men in the widening participation project say, yeah, and they just look at us as if we're scum, and they know they're being looked at, and then they kind of do a big resistant move on it and produce themselves as kind of heroic working class men. This doesn't happen with the women. They're just resentful of being judged, and they never know when it's going to happen. And there's a key funny moment in the book when they go to a very posh shop in Manchester, Kendall's, and they force the women to spray them with perfume. Now, it's very interesting in terms of class, because, you know, in posh department stores, as you walk in, you usually get sprayed. Yeah? How many people kind of try to avoid being sprayed? Most people kind of race through so they don't get sprayed. But these women knew they weren't going to get sprayed. Now, this is kind of the ethnography, isn't it? This is the great thing about ethnography. It's like, you're not getting sprayed, what's going on here kind of thing. And they used to kind of walk through and stand there, like full of, to make sure they got sprayed. Because they knew that they were not being judged as adequate to be sprayed. That's how minute these things are. Now, they can either go in there and they can do the politics of you will spray me, which they sometimes did, which was the comedy moment, or eventually, and this was a long, long project, they literally stopped going to places like Kendall's, and then they stopped going to places like Manchester. They self-exclude themselves from the places that they know they are judged as lacking. They literally lock themselves back into the cramped spaces that they are expected to be in. So not only are they kind of self-persecuting themselves for not having the right knickers, they're also kind of taking themselves out of the spaces in which they may be subject to judgment. And they were completely uncomprehending about this. They were also, and I'm making this into two different points, they were uncomprehending about why other people had authority. Why are those people, and there was lots of comments in the book, and they go, why are they judging us? Look at them. They don't know how to bring their kids up properly. They send their kids away. Why are they judging us? Absolute key kind of uncomprehension about the authority in the relationship. And so I think there's not enough emphasis in the book on judgment. And judgment is the missing hinge between the doing of subjectivity and being made subject. Judgment makes one subject. It literally puts one in place. But doing the subjectivity that responds to the judgment is how we then take on the standards of others, and I think is core to class relationships. And then, of course, I was really shocked when I went back, after you asked me to, where's ideology in the book? It's not even in the index. It's gone. And I think that is because I began with Althusser. Huge! I spent a year reading everything on ideology. Everything I knew could find in the world, I think. And I remember in this office reading it all and thinking I'm going mad. Because, if you start reading Althusser, you have to go back to Lacan and you have to get into psychoanalysis. I thought I was going to implode because I had no idea what they're talking about. So, I read all this stuff. I was dealing with all this stuff. I was arguing all this stuff, and then it just goes. Because the book then is written when I'm in a women's studies department debating post-structuralism and identity. So it's gone. And to me, it's probably the most important thing about the book that isn't in there. And you interestingly said you thought it was all about ideology. I think it's all about ideology, but somehow the analysis of it's gone. So I'm going to go back into now why I think it's all about ideology and why I think ideology is structured through value. So I'm not going to go into an Althusserian, Lacanian, misrecognition, psychoanalytic interpolation perspective. I'm going to go into investments. So why ideology? No mention. How could it be? As I've said, it began as an analysis of Thatcherism, probably one of the best ideologies we've ever seen in terms of, ideas coming into shape and being institutionalised and formulated through every power structure in the country. The state. It began as an understanding of, cuts in state welfare will be compensated for by working class women who will be doing caring but will be contained in caring courses, and domestic ideology. What is respectability about if it isn't, domestic ideology? So how it went is quite significant when you go back to look at it. And how, the whole book is about motherhood, ideologies of motherhood, how they move into motherhood as the source of value. Motherhood becomes the way in which they can have some value. Absolutely key. Femininity, they play with it. They sometimes perform it, they sometimes don't. They're not that kind of welded to it. It's something that they can be judged through. So they make some investments in it. Domestic ideals, cleaning, hygiene, all that sort of stuff, that's often quite important. Caring, very important. And how they work on developing all these. So really, really kind of key stuff. But what's very interesting is that I think the key to ideology is that they are working on themselves in the interests of another group. So the standards that they are imposing upon themselves are those which were developed for middle-class women to have a life outside of domestic containment. These are very different standards. They are trying to perform respectability to the standards of others. So they are working in the interests of another group. Absolutely key. That's the kind of hook, I would say. It's premised upon developing standards, though it's premised upon fulfilling the standards which actually position them as the limit to the standards to which they are trying to achieve. That makes sense? Which are constantly put into effect and which we now see spectacularly visualised. Now, I think ideology works, living up to the standards of another class and the interests of another class that are not in your own, through the investment of time and energy. So it's not kind of the labour power of going to work labour, it's the constant time and energy labour of working on oneself. So it is a theory of governmentality and self-persecution through governmentality. Huge amounts of time, energy and effort were put into proving themselves, defending against devaluation. That defence, I would argue, is an ideological move. They are defending against the standards of others, but by trying to prove that they have value, they are living up to the standards of others. Who's the dialogical, other that my mother is trying to live up to? Some imaginary bourgeois norm that she's probably never even seen is the standard that she's trying to achieve. She's consenting to the standard of an imaginary other that she doesn't know, that was generated from an entirely different history and an entirely different gender politics. By constantly performing defensive respectability, she's authorising that imaginary bourgeois other. She's actually giving those standards authority. I will perform that respectability. So all their actions are a claim for some sort of value. Now, since I've been developing, and I'm not since formations that is, the idea of person value, which is kind of trying to develop Bourdieu's ideas of how the working class can have value. They're not just the zero sum of culture. And I've done this by thinking through how the working class, and certainly in here, and again, not very well developed in here, although you can read it if you can see it if you look for it, a very, very different form of relationality, a very different form of caring. They don't work on the self as a project to be invested in as the kind of singular self that I map out in class self-culture. They actually spread their kind of time and energy into others. And this became really, really obvious. The most obvious example I have was from the reality television project, where the middle-class women didn't want to have the television on, sometimes hid the television, thought the television was an object that would seduce them, would make them waste their time. This was the key point to the time. Television made those who had valuable time waste it. For the working class women, they didn't think this at all. They had the television on 24/7 almost. Didn't even care about it. It wasn't something that's going to, make them do things. They weren't going to be seduced by it. They weren't going to become addicted. They weren't going to be hypnotised by it or anything like that. They just had it on. It wasn't that significant. They did demand that it should entertain them, but it often didn't. But I think that's because they had a completely different conception of time. For the working class women, being absorbed by the television wasn't that bad because their chances were they weren't in jobs that they had to continually invest in themselves and enterprise themselves up so they could have a future and a career, and precarious labour would be really, important and they could overcome it. They had time. They were unemployed, they were the working poor, and they often had kids to look after. So time wasn't a resource that could be wasted. For the middle class women, and I would include myself in this now, who's constantly, can't watch that programme because I've got another paper to write about television. But I can't watch it. It's that kind of thing, that continual investment in a future career that demands that time is thought about as a precious resource is very, very, very different. So I think time, the energy that one spends on others, and the commitment that one has to others. For the working class women, you'd ask them what they'd do, and they go, just going to see my family, going to see my friends, just going to do it. For the middle class women, you'd ask them what they were doing. Well, I'm going to the theatre, I'm going to read this book, I'm going to talk about this, and then I'm going to see these friends who are setting up a network on this, and then I'm going to go and do that, and then I'm going to this lecture, and then I'm going to do that. No spare time that wasn't filled with some value-producing activity. Very, very different use of time. So, coming, hopefully, to the end. So, why I want to argue, the way I want to think about ideology is an investment in value, a continual investment of one's time and energy in producing value. that means that's ideology working, not really ideology at work, as in formal work, ideology doing work. So I want to argue respectability is an ideological trap that works at the level of intimate subjectivity, because they make investments over time, and it's not just when they get into caring courses. From a very, very early age, I learned from my mother, it's all about my mother, I learned from a very, very early age, going to primary school, that I had to have matching clothes. Why? I'm going to mess them up. So it's like you learn, right? You're predisposed to respectability from such an early age. And then if that predisposition gets institutionalized, if you have no value, if you invest in defending against being valueless, you are literally investing in it over and over again to gain some sense of value. And by investing in caring, they become responsible, and it's very, very difficult to be an irresponsible carer. Responsibility is one of the key ways, I think, in which respectability gets put into effect. And then this is the killer. You get lots of pleasure and love from the intimate practices associated with the performance of respectability. If you've had a child, you can't say, I've invested in motherhood as a source of value, but it didn't really work, have it back. You've invested, you're with it, you're dispersing. You then start investing and producing value for your reproduction. And you get love and pleasure from it. You're in it. You're making investments in it. It's your time and energy. But also, you draw distance, from others by claiming respectable standards. Now, in formations, it's very explicit. They learn to identify who's a bad carer, who's a bad mother, who's a bad person, who's a bad child. And they literally, the classroom exercises go through it. Who's a bad, you have to list all the bad qualities. So you learn to identify. I just think most people learn what is good and bad, what is proper, what is improper. And again, women's magazines, reality television is legislating continually over what is good and bad, what is a good and bad practice. And motherhood is probably the killer. Again, really, really competitive motherhood. Helen, who I'm doing the media project with, had a baby last year and is pregnant again. And she just tells me these stories of competitive motherhood. Are they giving them the right food? One morning this is a woman who can't cook, hates food, and doesn't like bourgeois dinners and restaurants, doesn't like going out and sampling anything new, who was up grilling beef and mixing it with, I think it was yoghurt at 5 o'clock in the morning. I was like, you don't know how to cook. So what are you doing? You're only going to burn everything. She bought a blender for the first time in her life to blend this food. Oh, this is going out. Sorry, Helen, if you watch this. Blending this food, I'm thinking, what's going on? And she said it's about the trap that you have to give your child good, healthy, proper food with all the vitamins, and if you don't do it, you're a really, really bad mother. And you're being judged constantly by your mum and baby group, by your health worker, by everybody you talk to, and if you don't do this and you haven't got it in ice cube trays in your fridge, you're really, really evil. So I said, why don't you just buy it? Oh, no, you can't buy baby food. So, it's like competitive motherhood, I think, is becoming increasingly significant, and the consumption associated with competitive motherhood. Have you got the right pram or whatever it is? It's absolutely crucial. So that, this becomes a really big competitive trap. And so it's not just self-persecution, it's the persecution of other women for not living up to the standards that you yourself cannot live up to. So, this is kind of a big ideological move, because it's not just on yourself. So they start judging themselves, and then they start judging others. But when people have no other sources of dominant symbolic value, this is one of the ways in which they're going to make their own. So I think these are traps. These are traps that are structured through care, through gender, but literally structured through class impossibilities. Can you or can you not find other sources of value? So conclusions. I'd want to argue formations is still significant, because as long as people are living through the scrutiny and judgment of others, where the dialogic gaze produces an understanding of one's lack of value, people will try and gain value. In the UK at the moment, respectability is still more pressing. It is a really difficult moment. There is so much hatred against the working class. There is so much contempt, derision. There is so much institutional criminalisation against the working class. There are so many attempts to distinguish between the rough and the respectable. And there are so many attempts to make injustice appear as if it's a psychological, individualised problem. We have increased inequality, injustice, violence and hatred. And I'd actually say, and I would say that the coalition government that we have at the moment is much more horrific than Thatcherism, because they are withdrawing all the money from education, which actually even Thatcherism kept. So they literally don't mind kids being on the street rioting because they have enough police. Well, they may not, because they're making cuts in the police, which is quite an interesting anomaly at the moment. See how that one plays out. Because if you saw the police backing off the rioters, was a very interesting moment in British history. Like, not just going in to attack them, which is what they normally do, because the police are being cut and their pensions are being cut. So if the government cuts the police pensions more, we may not see the kind of criminalisation in the same way. But that's another issue. But there is massive increased inequality, injustice, violence and hatred. And what we have is a whole group without futures, without hope. So what happens when you can't have value through even an investment in the future? Because in the past, lots of people thought, well, I'll suffer education now to have a job in the future. But if there are no jobs, if there is no future, where do you generate value from? So I want to argue against the post-structuralist me that wrote Formations of Class and Gender, that respectability is not just a discourse. It's a very powerful ideological practice that sustains class inequality and injustice, which is lived at the level of intimate subjectivity. It's one of the key ways in which women in particular, but men also, are incited to invest in the values, judgments and standards of others, which leave them feeling guilty, ashamed, inadequate and isolated. And I think we need to think about how to resist people feeling subject to the effective power of judgment and humiliation, where all their energy has to be put into showing that they have value. So this is the final slide. So I think the Formations women, this is where I want to kind of do a little bit of positivity after that ideological onslaught. The Formations women attempt to generate alternative values and standards, just like the women in the reality TV project. They want to spend time with their friends. They want to spend time with other people. They don't just want to invest in themselves in order to have a future that is so precarious at the moment. We don't know whether even the enterprising self will work. We also are beginning to see, I think, visualised again on reality TV, for those of you who turn it off when it comes on. It is the sociological experiment, I think. Again, La Dette to Lady, the refusals to be respectable. Women in La Dette to Lady are represented as the absolute excess. Everything they do is meant to be absolutely, totally disgusting. The real constitutive limit. They have loads of sex, they vomit all over people, they burp all the time, they're really loud, they're really aggressive, they're having fights all the time. They are the absolute non-respectable. But they've become quite a kind of comedy cult moment. And lots of people think they're much more interesting than the aristocratic ladies who are saying, you must behave. So there's a whole kind of, I think what it does is visualise a moment of refusal, where the women on La Dette to Lady clearly know respectability doesn't pay off for their mums, for their sisters, for their friends. It's not working for them, so they might as well just have the best time they possibly can, being the worst possible subjects they possibly can. And I'm wondering if this is one of the most recent innovative feminist challenges that we've seen. I'm not sure. The jury's out. But it is very interesting because there's no investment. There's no hope. There's almost no future. They just want to have a good time without accepting judgments of others, and they challenge the judgments of others. So I think this means rethinking, and I think most people are now moving out of this, but kind of rethinking how we make claims for recognition, how political claims are made, and how politics is thought. And we really should try and be a bit more sceptical about those that rely upon respectability. And then I think, kind of putting it back to my own self-responsibility or into a smaller scale, I think we need to identify, imagine, think and understand ways of being and doing person value that are not just through all our new theories of subjectivity in the self, which are all about the new, the good, bourgeois, capitalist subject. I think they are limiting our imaginary to think about how politics is actually working, and we need to think beyond it. So, thank you. Thank you.
Då har vi lite frågestund och jag går runt med mikrofon för de som vill ställa frågor så att det hörs ordentligt. Så det är bara att räcka upp handen.
Hi.
Oh, sorry, I should take it in English too if you're English speaking. It's time for questions. Yeah. Oh.
Right, well, thanks very much for a lovely lecture. And very interesting to hear also how you updated some of your previous analysis. Now, one question that I'm sure you've had lots of times are to do with the, you might say, the comparative value, as it were, of your research on class and gender in Britain. I mean, it has been said about Bourdieu that his work is fine, but it only works in France, because it's really his entire life's work after he left the Kabyles is about the French peculiar concoctations of class, symbolic violence and hierarchy, which you don't find in any other European countries. I mean, and Britain has its own class system, and it seems to me sometimes that everything in Britain comes down to class, you know, every political discussion. Just like, I mean, in America it's about race, in Norway it's about rural, urban, and so on. And yet there are lots of things in what you say that ring familiar for those of us who have worked in other parts of the world. I mean, in the Caribbean, you also have notions of respectability, which are gendered and which are associated with class. You know, being respectable is being a woman and middle class. And if you're a woman and working class, you have to work really hard at being respectable. Whereas if you're a man, you're fine with reputation. Because a man should go out and conquer the world and shouldn't care too much about going to church and having a nicely sort of starched shirt and that sort of thing. So I'm just like to ask you about that, you know, the comparative value of this analysis of class in Britain.
I think it works in the Caribbean because of British colonialism. And I think there's a brilliant article. And I'm trying to think. I think I do reference it. No, I think I read it after I'd finished this book. Cecily Jones, who works in Barbados, and it's about when the powerful white middle class in Barbados, the colonialists, thought they were losing power, they started to recruit what they had previously considered to be the kind of disreputable sex worker women who were brought out to kind of service people. And they started kind of trying to recruit them into their ranks to consolidate their power against the blacks that they thought were going to rebel. So they were trying to kind of recruit middle-class blacks into respectability and produce a kind of new class, as we see in kind of all slave plantation stuff. But also, interestingly, and this was quite a challenge to the British government, who realised, and there's some she kind of documents the historical sources on this, realises that there's kind of that the production of a black middle class is seen to be less threatening at home than the recruitment of the kind of really dirty, despicable, supposedly contagious sex workers into the middle class. So the kind of, you've got to keep the kind of politics much more separate. So there's some really, really interesting work on that. So I think it works in the Caribbean because of British colonialism, in the British colonial Caribbean. I don't know, because I was just thinking about that in places like Haiti that have had the most interesting kind of, you know, slave revolts and whatever else, and were really, really kind of revolts based on not respectability, and there's some quite serious struggles around that. I don't know enough, and that would be interesting because kind of the French models of historical distinction during that time were quite different as well, because it was like the aristocracy and the slave workers, really. So that would be different. I think it has different manifestations, and I do think it is all structured through class. And I think in Britain, I would say that, of course, but in Britain you do have it's writ large, it's really, really obvious. But I think if you look at the US, you know, it is about it may be spoken through race, but it is about class relationships because, you know, it's the black poor who are seen to be the problem. And it's the black poor who are written off as the kind of welfare cheats, the underclass, the crack mothers, all that kind of stuff. So all the figures that come out of race are all class figures in that sense. So I think if you do your mapping, it kind of can work in various different ways. But you have to be quite careful empirically. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. My question is about judgment. And judgment is very central in your talk and in your work. At the same time, I was thinking about Hannah Arendt, who wrote about absence of judgment and lack of judgment based on her study on Eichmann and, you know, lack of judgment based on thoughtlessness. So do you see any link between this lack of judgment and this increasing of judgment? I mean, they exist parallel to each other, or what do you think?
God, that's a really hard question, because it's almost as if her critique of the bureaucratic structures that come into effect deny judgment, I'd argue. They are a way of hiding the really powerful judgments that are being made, I think. But that would be my position on it. So I think it's where judgment is made explicit or not. And I think one of the things in the first writing of this was that judgment is structuring everything. That implicit, implied, dialogical judgment is everywhere. But I don't make it that explicit. But when you go back, you can see the women know. They're making it explicit. So I'm not... It's an interesting question, because I'm not entirely sure... By making it explicit, I want to attribute responsibility. So that does come back to Arendt's analysis. Because I want to say those who are making the judgment should be held responsible for the judgments they are making. So say at the moment, to use a kind of colloquial example, the word chav has been used. You know, the Oxford English Dictionary word of 2004, the most popular word in Britain, to basically condense the hatred of the working class and to make it legitimate to speak hatred. That person's chavvy, that person's a chav. So it is a word that legitimates judgment and hatred. But nobody, when they're using it, thinks they're explicitly being hating or doing the judging. But so by making it explicit, I want to say, take responsibility for being a snob. Take responsibility for the judgment call you're making. But even if I don't make that political call, it's still happening. So it's about what work does making explicit do, and where does it locate responsibility, I think. And I think that's what Arendt's kind of trying to do on a much bigger scale, saying that a lot of this obfuscates what is actually happening through systems. Does that make sense?
Anyone else? Oh.
Well, down here.
Thank you, Beverley. Nice to see you. I have a question about resistance, and can the working class girls or women in your study make... you said that they are trying to set an alternative values or standards, but would you use the term or the concept resistance for that, or and if not, why not? It's like a way of taking up what you were saying in the end about these excessive women who wants to have fun all the time, and how to understand that. Can working class people in general resist, or is that a middle class strategy?
Well, I want to hope so, yes. I think the reason I probably, even in the book, avoided the word resistance was there was a big educational debate. I don't know who, you might remember this, I remember it, about are people accommodating or resisting? And so it's kind of divided into a polarisation. And I always felt, well, actually sometimes they're doing both at the same time. It's kind of a simultaneous movement. And if we look at it over time, we can see how different things are happening. And then again, it was as if the theorists wanted resistance to do a lot of work, wanted people to be the resistant subject, so that they were always perfectly resistant. Whereas I do think there are moments when we'll resist, and there are moments when we don't, when we have no idea what we're doing, actually. And so I think if you look at, say, the Ladette to Lady Ladettes, you get much more refusal. So they're not necessarily positively resisting, they're just going, no, we're not going to do this. It's not like because resistance was associated with the kind of Gramscian fully worked out politics. People knew what they were doing. Where I think a lot of the time people don't know what they're doing, but they know they don't want to be persecuted. So it's almost, sometimes it's pre-political in that Gramscian sense. They're kind of doing something that looks resistant, but it may not be. But they're definitely refusing to be powerless at that moment. And I think there's a big, big difference. Now, I do argue this in the book, and I've always argued it. There's a huge difference between having power and resisting powerlessness. And I don't think resisting one necessarily takes you into the other. And I think that gap really needs thinking about.
Yes, I wanted to actually to add to that question about resistance, or maybe a bit also to Thomas' question about the comparative, the possibilities of comparison, since we as anthropologists just immediately start thinking of other societies, and I was because as you were talking, I was struck by how you repeat this very hopelessness of the whole thing, that they. I mean, and your point there is clear, of course, that they cannot, trying to gain respectability is giving authority to another class judging them. But then there was some kind of maybe hope or resistance in that you say that there is some kind of practice trying to generate alternative values, and these are then have to be around caring and relationality, and that is, of course, something that we can see in lots of cultures around the world. And I don't know, this is why I'm thinking about if it has to do with perspective or not, because anthropologists, for instance, have been able to find how the most marginal, subordinated groups in societies that already also are marginal and subordinated in a global scale, to find the creation of ways of, and here I don't know if the terms are the same, of creating alternative values, or at least sometimes we just say making their lives meaningful. And of course, this might not be the same as trying to gain respectability. There are various terms here, but so what I wanted to say was that it seemed. Then I thought, is it because of a perspective, or either you are right in that this group, British working class women, actually have even less space than other groups. I'm thinking, for instance, of studies of black motherhood, Carol Stack's early work on how meaning and value are created in the activities of caring and relationality. So the interesting question is if there is such a kind of difference, and why in that case when you make comparisons with others, and then I just have a hypothesis that might be that creating these kind of alternative values can be done when you are really marginal, so as to, and far away from a middle class constantly judging you. Maybe this is just and that these British that it actually has to do with the class relationship, that the judgment of the middle class is so kind of dominant and very present in their life. It's just a thought.
Just an essay. Yeah. Well, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely right. Because in class self-culture, I really use a lot of Marilyn Strathern's work on perspective and relationality to try and understand how we are understanding class in various different ways. Because I began that book thinking it was about the working class, and it wasn't. I in fact, ended up writing a book on the middle class about the new bourgeois subject and its various manifestations. You know, every single new sociological theorist has a theory of the subject: prosthetic, mobile, individual, risk. I can't remember. There's about 10 of them. There's all these different new modern bourgeois subjects. So it was an attempt to challenge that perspective, that the way we understand modern subjectivity is through the bourgeois self-investing, accruing value subject, which I even realise Bourdieu fits into through the concept of the habitus, because it's about value, composition, accumulation over time. And I didn't want him to be included in it, but he was in the end. But that's definitely that perspective. So perspective is absolutely key. And the reason I wrote the person value paper was was trying to imagine how we think beyond. Imagine how our feminist and cultural and social theories enable us to think beyond, enable us not to be influenced by capitalism, enable us not to just think with a model of the capital subject, the subject that exists to have a future. And then I started kind of using Marx to think about time and energy use just by kind of having to not wanting to reteach it. And I do think the relationality, because the stuff about living lives, because when you were talking, I was thinking, the livable life argument, making life livable or making life meaningful is coping. And one of the things that comes out of here, one of the things that comes out of the next project is that, the women really value, one of their key values is endurance. All the studies on black women and family organisation, endurance. And I'm thinking, endurance, is that a good value? As in morally, to endure? And then the other one is indefatigability. They can just keep going at work, and for a lot of working class men, just to keep working is really, really, that's my dad, not my mum, keep working, that's what gives you value, that's the good thing. And you think, are these good values? So that's why I got into time. And you know all about time. That's why I got into time, because it's what do you spend your time on? And how can you spend your time? And so if all your time is a very precious resource, you literally mobilise differently in relation to others. You're not giving out, you're not giving your time to others, you're using it for yourself. So I thought time and labour, time, energy expended, became very important in that sense. So the relationality isn't about making lives meaningful as such, it's about how you organise the time of your life. Yeah, that fits into your work, doesn't it? Yeah. So it's that kind of, it's a very different ontology. And I think what we do is we look at, as theorists, we look at life through epistemology. And really, people are actually totally organising their life, in different ways. And, Marilyn Strathern, Melanesia, where, is about organising time differently, organising exchange differently, organising value differently. And so she kind of got me into thinking how if we think only about tournaments of value, the apoduri model of value, we're still stuck within a capital understanding, self-accruing subject model. So perspective, definitely, absolutely key. But time, I think, is really, time and where you expend it and who you expend it on. Because I've had days when I think, I should be going to visit somebody, Like one of the subjects of the reality TV project, the 80-year-old woman, I think, oh, God, it's Les Back's mum. And I was thinking, God, I really should go and visit her and see if she's all right. And it's like, no, I've got to finish this paper. And then you kind of go to yourself, God, who are you? What matters to you? So what matters rather than almost meaningfulness and the decisions we make, I think, key. But
I have a question. Would you say there's a word like racism or sexism or homophobia for oppression of the working class and underclass? Because I've started to use a word called classism, because I don't have any other word. And also because I think you described very, very well what could be in that word. I mean, what the oppression looks like in different words. Because I find when I try to stress that there are oppression towards the working class and try to say what words or what, how you talk about or how you go about the working class, it's very often I end up in a discussion that's very based on, you think that, but I think differently.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is a question, but what do you say about my thoughts?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's how you want to play it rhetorically almost. So I would say class hatred. It's like, well, why do you hate when people go, those chavvy people, they don't know how to dress? I say, well, why do you want to be such a snob? Why do you want to hate people so much? Kind of throw it back. What is it about you that makes you want to dislike people so much and judge them so much? Because, part of me became quite perplexed by that when I started charting it. And bizarrely, I wasn't the only person perplexed. in 1982, Margaret Thatcher had a key policy advisor called Ferdinand Mount, who's a member of the British aristocracy. And he's just written a book a year ago called Minding the Gap. And it's absolutely bizarre. This Thatcher advisor, aristocrat, says, why is there so much class hatred in Britain? And he says, we now have this very nasty, misanthropic society full of vitriol. And it's bizarre, because, and it's almost, now I'd argue that's because, you know, the aristocracy have never persecuted, apart from colonialism, but, you know, have never been directly involved in persecuting the working class in the same way as the middle class. They kind of, you know, they think they're all above it. But there's something very interesting going on there, that this gap, when resources get really tight between the different classes, the kind of the hatred and the vitriol becomes much more acute, I think. And so classism is a good word, but in a way it doesn't even express as much of what is going on. Just like sexism doesn't really, because a lot of the, you know, the early analysis of sexism is like pure misogyny. You know, why do you hate women so much? They're not that evil. You know, it's that kind of thing. So it's almost as if, instead of using the term, just ask why people want to use the term. Why they want to do that. Because in a way it is a bit baffling when you see some people and their whole life is based upon just putting down others. And you think, just get on with your own life and leave them alone. You know, there is something odd, I think. There is something really odd. But what it reveals to me is a phenomenal insecurity. Phenomenal insecurity that they have to keep assuaging through saying we are not those people. And what's interesting, if you look at the kind of the more modern histories of social work, it is those that are very, very proximate to the working class that end up doing the monitoring of the working class. There's a great article by Phil Cohen where he says, you know, why is it that those who a generation ago would have been the working class are now the ones who are the most punitive towards them? It's a kind of understanding in those terms. But yeah, just, you know, rhetorically argue, why do you want to hate people so much? And it works for racism, it works for sexism, it works for all of them, really. Does that help?
Sorry, did you want to reply? Yes. Did you want to reply on that?
Follow up a bit on this, but go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question, maybe a very silly one, in relation to what you have been just talking about. You have very nicely defined class previously. You know, class is a relational category, and but I think it's been used so much and almost abused in both kind of political and colloquial discourses. And we all seem to understand what the working class is, and we all seem to understand what the upper class or aristocracy is. But what is the middle class, and how do you, in general, define the categories which we use in this stratification type when we distinguish different classes? Sort of how do you operationalize maybe those categories?
Yeah, well, operationalize is the key term. You'd have to do it through kind of empirical understandings of what are the practices that people do that enable them to make claims for particular positions. Yep. So people would say, I am this, I am respectable, and then you look at how that manifests and how they're doing it, how value is generated from it, what forms of exchange they can undertake. And histories are very, very important. What historical legacies are they able to deploy and institutionalise? So for me, it would always be an analysis of positioning, possibility, political claims and relations. So that's why I say I wouldn't just be able to say, you know, that is middle class. You need that whole empirical analysis to understand. So it's not just you will fit into this category because you have this job.
Yes, I understand that it's very difficult to do it on an individual level, but if you sort of do it on a more abstract level, like what is middle class with all those criteria that you've mentioned?
Well, then you put all those criteria together and see how they came into effect. Yeah, and I mean, historically, incredibly important, thinking about how people are literally inherit particular positions and are able to put legacies into effect, like respectability would be a key one, and access to various resources. So I don't think it's a straightforward matter. I think you have to do it. You have to do the work empirically to understand how they come into effect and how they manifest in different spaces. So, across the world, they take different forms. And then they take different forms globally.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it's not easy to answer.
Did we have any else? Yeah.
Yeah, fit.
Thank you. Yeah, I really found this brilliant in all ways. But I have a question. I was curious about this with the discussion that was before also about resistance and reproduction. And since one of those you mentioned was okay. You mentioned Paul Willis, for example, who in his study of working class kids from the 70s, learning to labor, in a similar way, pointed out how their resistance towards middle class values placed them in a position where they would accept and be placed in precisely the subordinate position that waited for them in the working class, so to speak. And in a way, you said a little bit similar in your... But on the other hand, you also stressed very much against Bourdieu, for example, that it's important not just to see how these practices, even though they are maybe even resistant or at least refusals, that they reproduce the ruling order, so to speak, but also how there are disruptions. And it was very interesting and exciting, I think. But then I thought also there must be a relation between these new forms that you mentioned, partly new at least in the reality shows and so on, and how the identification processes in the middle classes and the upper classes. Because, for instance, and I wonder if you have run across any research in that respect, because I thought myself about one kind of such new research, which is about taste patterns among young people from the 19th, before the 90s, you would say. Most of the young people with cultural capital, the educated or with money, they would have very strong distastes towards the low culture, so to speak, and they identified with jazz music or art music and so on. Today, after the 90s, there are signs of that is changing. So the elites today, for them it's an honor to appreciate both high and low culture. So maybe there is a change of taste patterns in the elites as well. And does this mean that the injustices will be disrupted from both ends, so to speak, or is it a new way of ordering the class society?
Well, another essay to answer. First of all, I think the changing middle class tastes, all the kind of cultural omnivore debates, that it's not just the reproduction of high culture that secures middle class legitimacy. I've argued that part of that process is what I call affect stripping. The middle classes who work in the media, and they do, now we can chart this really, really well empirically, because of the universities that they come from, the practices that they enact, the histories that they have, and the money that they inherit, and the fact that they can live in London on temporary contracts is kind of key to being middle class in an urban way. But they have extended tastes, and they don't just have extended tastes, they also have to perform cool. So they have to show that not only do they have access to all these tastes, which is the culture of others in a traditional anthropological appropriation form, they also can perform them. And I've argued that I call that affect stripping. So that what we see, again, in particular with middle-class men, is that they kind of strip the affects of the black and white working class, potentially criminalised man, who's glamorous, dangerous, sexy. And they try and perform that. And when they perform it, they don't get criminalised, they don't get arrested, and they don't lose their jobs. In fact, they add value to themselves through that affect stripping and through that cultural appropriation. Whereas when the working class black and white men do it, they do get criminalised. I mean, you know, young black men in Britain, huge numbers. I think it's an enormous figure. 64% have been criminalised before the age of 18 in London. Huge number, huge number. So you've got the kind of cultural intermediaries, we could call them, and I would call them that in a very particular, precise way. Cultural intermediaries, literally, not just stripping the culture, but stripping the affect so that they can perform the culture properly in order to secure their futures and jobs as cultural intermediaries. So they become kind of arbiters of taste and performers of other people's affects, which have very different consequences for them. So I don't think that's a positive thing at all. I think it's it's even more pernicious than just going, you don't know Shakespeare. You know? I think it's much more dangerous and much more powerful. Much more powerful, because it's basically saying everything, and you need a source to keep producing these affects. So it's not just as if you strip it. You need that source to continually perform. So I think there's something going on there. And I don't think it's kind of... It's not an identification process. It's not, I want to be you, I am you. It's just like I'll have those bits of you that I can have that are useful to me. So I think there's a different thing going on there if we're talking about the middle classes. Now, I know that this is seriously resented, and we have a whole culture based around young black kids trying to stop their culture being appropriated. So they have loads of terms of abuse for middle-class white men who try and steal their culture. And there's a range of it. And we have it in comedy programmes or whatever else, but it kind of keeps being reproduced quite quickly. That struggle is reproduced quite quickly. Very, very different for white working-class men who don't have the kind of black cultural value, who stand in for violence. They are usually pure violence. So that becomes something quite different. And they are not appropriated as cool in the same way, but can get used in advertising campaigns in different ways. So, you know, it's that kind of who can take things off others, who has access to them, who can replenish them and who can use them. So in the Class Self-Culture book, it is a model of who can take things. And it's about time, it's about what happens to them, it's about the institutionalisation of it. Now, in a way, that's a bit different from the Willis thing, because when Willis and I were writing very, very, very early on, the working class boys of Willis get trapped in through their own performance of masculinity, but that's what they're doing to themselves. Whereas I think if we look at the middle class, they're not just doing it to themselves, they're taking everybody else's stuff all the time, whatever they can. And I think that's quite different. There's some really good stuff. David Garland, the criminologist, has done some really interesting stuff on movement through space and who can move, and how the working class in very particular neighbourhoods have to be policed. They have to be kept in their neighbourhoods so that the middle class can move through London more effectively. So there's all sorts of very interesting stuff around space and containment as well, not just kind of culture and containment, that I think is really, really important. But that probably doesn't answer the question about ambiguity, authority and resistance. But
you said that Pierre Bourdieu he didn't understand the powerless, but you are using Pierre Bourdieu. How come?
I use him to understand how power works. So I'm not using him to understand the powerless. I kind of move off from him to understand gender, to understand femininity, and to understand responses to power. Now, it's a highly contentious area.
But if the question is how to increase our capital, the starting point is a middle-class starting point, and the circle is finalistic. You start and you end in the same circle. You are starting from his middle class point. If you ask the question, how to increase our capital, and starts with Bourdieu, I think.
I begin with Bourdieu, yeah, definitely, to look at who can and who cannot have his different capitals, and then I move on to values, which I think I think relationality is quite different from Bourdieu's social capital or cultural capital. because he would say that we always engage in either social or cultural capital to increase our capital. And I'm saying no, actually these people are engaging in relationality to disperse capital. They're giving their time away, they're giving their energy away. So it's an entirely different model. So I begin with Bourdieu, definitely, without a doubt. But then I move on from that.
Do we have any more questions?
Very briefly follow up on some of the things that we said about comparison, because I think it's quite important, I mean, to try to frame your research and to see to what extent it travels and to what extent it's context-bound, right? Because there is something very peculiar to the class structure of Britain, which every visitor is struck by, you know, the moment you arrive. How working class people, they dress differently, they move differently, they look different, you know, which you don't find in Germany or Sweden.
Oh, you
so
do.
Not in the same way. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
you do.
Right.
I saw them last night. I lived here for 6 months and I can recognise them now.
Yeah, but I think, you know, a key formulation in your lecture was the notion that these women do not want to be middle class. Now, a new concept that has come into Scandinavian languages is that of the class journey, klassresan, following the publication of a book by a highly respected historian, Ronny Ambjørnson, who writes about his own past. I mean, how he started out as a working class rural person and you know, ended up as where he was. And his story is in many ways a history of Scandinavia in the post-war years, where so many, hundreds of thousands of people had made that transformation and have converted, as it were, the capital, if you want to use that kind of term, and become middle class. I wonder if that kind of thing would be possible in Britain, where there is so much resentment and hatred among the working class against the middle class. You would be seen as a class traitor, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
To a greater extent.
Yeah, and huge debates. In the 1970s, we had the embourgeoisement. Mustn't put the other bit in. The embourgeoisement debate. Key social theorists Goldthorpe and Lockwood said all factory workers were becoming bourgeois. But then Fiona Devine did a great study when she went back to interview all these people and realised that they weren't at all, and that, you know, it depends on what sort of questions you ask people. So we've had that debate. And I think what is quite significant to it, there's loads of dimensions to it, but one of the really key significant dimensions to it, and one of the big critiques in Britain, is a great paper in Feminist Review by Steph Lawler. And she asks, why do we conceptualise class mobility as escape? Why is it always about the movement from the working class that has to be left behind? And what that does is kind of rhetorically, and figuratively, position working class culture as something that's bad. Again, deficit again. It's got to be moved off from. I achieve something by leaving that residue behind. And so, for me, that the emphasis on mobility. Now, the emphasis on mobility in Britain, when there is absolutely, according to every single empirical measure from every, you know, traditional quantitative sociologist and economist, there is no social mobility in Britain. And there hasn't been for the last 5 years. And that's everybody. If there is any, it's any movement, it's middle-class women literally kind of slightly moving down. And there's a lot of unemployment, which, you know, decreases. Now, remember I said I'm not really into measurement. So I'm deploying it rhetorically. But it's very, very interesting that while there is this absolutely no empirical mobility whatsoever, people keep talking about how I made it, meritocracy, I got into the middle classes, I am this, I am that. So therefore, we have to look at what they're talking about. Now, often it is culture, and in Sweden I'm sure it's quite different. And I'm not making any claims, Fanny can talk about that, any claims for Sweden at all. But I think in Britain, the stories of class mobility are usually incredibly exceptional from a very particular historical period, and are used a bit like, we always call it the Tesco meritocracy story. The man who, or Alan Sugar could be the other one. We have two key figures on British television who, you know, rags to riches stories, who are then set up as anybody can do it. So the kind of the rhetoric that's done by that journey, but that's done by the story of a journey, is, I think, really needs interrogating as a literary device almost. Really needs interrogating in terms of what it does. Now, in Sweden, it may be a story of rural to urban or something else. But in Britain, that story, we know, has no empirical grounding whatsoever. but we know that it gets told continually, usually by the Daily Mail or the Sun or something like that. You know, you can do it, and if you don't become the Tesco millionaire, it's because you are psychologically inadequate. You know, so it's kind of used as a persecutory story as well. So when I hear mobility, I kind of go, ooh, you know, because it's like, what sort of mobility? What work is the story doing? What rhetorical claims is it trying to make? And how is it trying to connect to all other forms of class relationship? So I don't know enough to be able to...
Lots of people used to work in factories, they now work in offices.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, the call centre is the new factory. We know that in terms of conditions. It's even worse. They're not allowed to join unions. You know, so there's some horrific, like, time controls in new call centres. So the shift to service work doesn't necessarily mean we've become middle class, because look who's doing it, how they're being paid, whatever.
They have master's degrees and they earn a lot more money. So
but, you know, that could just be credential inflation. People now have to get more degrees to do the same job that they would have been doing before. So, you know, again, it needs really good, you know that, you're an anthropologist, really good empirical, you know, understanding of what this is, what work this story is actually doing, I think. Yeah.
We have to stop here. We are already late.
The anthropological front bench.
Yeah. Thank you, Beverley. I think it was the most important lecture I've heard for years.
Oh,
yeah, it was indeed. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you. Thank you. Wow. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for all the questions and all your...
Great, thanks a lot.
We can carry on.
I thought we should have a lively discussion, so I wanted to be a bit proper.
Yeah.